want to extend my thanks today to Larry and to the Executive Office for the support to the preparation for this conference and for this meeting. And I find it unusual that I'm here to talk about a small event, a small flood. We don't have 6 million population or 4 million population, but we've got a lot of people that were significantly impacted by a major event that occurred in May of 2010. The irony of the efforts that we're making toward mitigation from that flood event that continues every day, every week, every month that goes by is that we continue to see more events that take place. We have a tendency to characterize our events by the pictures that we take. This is a young couple that was clinging for life to the luggage rack on the top of a Jeep at an intersection during that flood next to a creek in Nashville. They've since grown up over the 8 years. She's married to somebody else who probably protects her more appropriately. The interstate highway between Chattanooga and Nashville crosses the Mill Creek, and one of the large pointed structure to the right of this is a portable classroom from a private school that was floating down the interstate along with the tractor trailers and the cars that are now bobbing up to their roof lines. A picture of downtown, that's the intersection of Lower Broadway and First Avenue. That's where it all happens, honky-tonk heaven. And then the areas around Opryland, Opry Mills Mall. This is a picture of the Opry Mills Mall, which was ultimately closed for 2 years, and there's still about a $200 million lawsuit in the works on that project, but it's functioning and working again. And just above that is the Opryland Hotel, which up until about that time was the largest hotel in the world outside of Las Vegas. I think there are 7 hotels in Las Vegas bigger than Opryland. But they sustained about $70 million worth of damage to that structure that night, and they were one of the first of the large entities in Nashville with the onset, with the arrival of this flood, that made a decision to evacuate every resident of that building, and they moved them to that large church structure that's just beyond the highway in the upper part of that picture. Titan Stadium sustained about $7 million worth of damage, but it sits right on the banks of the Cumberland River in downtown Nashville. So we look at these pictures, we think these are extreme events. There's a tendency around the industry to say, let's don't call it a 100-year flood or a 500-year flood anymore, let's call it a 1%. And my message is that none of the citizens know what that means anyway, so we typically in Nashville will call it just a big honking flood. But the reality is you've got to be cognizant of the need to be doing things to ensure that the results of the last flood aren't manifested again in the next event. And we had, on August the 31st of this past summer, a significant event in Nashville that we referred to as the Remnants of Harvey storm. And so as Harvey finished its damage over Texas and Louisiana, it worked its way up, and it sat and swirled for a couple of days over the Nashville, the Middle Tennessee area, and we had one of the most significant rain events that we've had since the 2010 flood associated with that event. And a lot of what we've accomplished in terms of mitigation and in terms of flood forecasting tools played out that night as we spent the night in the emergency operations center, and I'll show you some of the stuff that we worked with during that time. So this goes to what I was just talking about. News articles, Houston is experiencing its third 500-year flood in 3 years. How is that possible? Historic Maryland town hit by second devastating flood since 2016. Only 20 months separate their two 1,000-year flood events. Cedar Rapids, Iowa braces for second biggest river flood on record. And we, quite frankly, have an appreciation that we express to Cedar Rapids because in Nashville, if you've never been through one of these, it really changes the status of your team. You go from amateur status to professional status when you get engaged in a flood recovery. We called Cedar Rapids in the days following our flood, and one of the most poignant messages that they gave us was that you have to enforce your floodplain ordinance. And in Nashville, we have some higher standards. One that's talked about, it was talked about in a couple of sessions here yesterday, is that we have a 4-foot freeboard requirement that was set in 1979 Nobody's real sure where that came from, but we know it's in place. And where that plays in to your mitigation for homeowners, home buyers, homeowners that are trying to restore their property is that if you're more than 50% damaged, if you're substantially damaged, you've got to elevate that structure to that 4-foot freeboard level. So there were a lot of cases, I'll show you some pictures, of some houses that were elevated 8 to 10 feet. Not uncommon. And then, state of emergency in Louisiana as atmospheric river unloads disastrous rains. Now that door was opened here 2 days ago. Atmospheric rivers. And from what I've been able to determine, that term has only been in use for about the last 10 to 20 years, probably by a relatively small segment of climate scientists and research engineers. But it's significant from the standpoint that, as we heard on Tuesday in the first plenary session, Christy Jones talked about the damage to the Oroville spillway in California, and that storm was caused by an atmospheric river. I'd never heard the term atmospheric river before, but last spring I attended the Flood Risk Management Conference in St. Louis, the Silver Jackets Corps of Engineers workshop, if you will. And during that conference, I met Dr. Corey Talbot, who is a research engineer with the Corps of Engineers, Army Research and Development Center in Vicksburg, Mississippi. Us old-timers would know that as the Waterways Experiment Station. But I talked to Dr. Talbot, and he said to me, he looked at my name tag and he said, Nashville, Tennessee, May 1st and 2nd, 2010. And I said, yeah, that's when it happened. He said, that was an atmospheric river. And so I began to wonder to what extent these atmospheric rivers have a play in the way we react to these storms and events, and the way the extent of the damage that's caused, the amount of rain that falls. And so I found a few slides in an ERDIC slide, Dr. Talbot's a presentation that he's done recently. And this is an example of an atmospheric river that's feeding Northern California. And you can see that it says it dropped 16 inches of rain in one day in Central California. And the definition on this slide, a narrow conveyor belt of water vapor extending from thousands of miles out at sea, carrying on average about 10 Mississippi rivers. And I've seen some articles that say it can carry from 5 to 15 Mississippi rivers as measured at the mouth of the Mississippi. In California, it provides 35 to 50% of their annual rainfall, and Christy told us last week that they've had 50 in the last year. But I asked Dr. Talbot, he and I were emailing this past week, and so I asked him, I said, what other of these major events are being caused by this atmospheric river situation? So we see again on that slide, the extreme left of the slide, the California atmospheric river, but right smack in the middle, and this is from his presentation, that is the Nashville flood of May of 2010. It was an atmospheric river that was generated across Central America, across the Yucatan Peninsula, and the slang among those in the industry is that it's a Mayan express as opposed to a pineapple express that's coming from Hawaii and affecting the west coast. And the other example on the right side is Snowmageddon. And Snowmageddon, if you lived on the East Coast, happened early in the year of 2010. All three of those are significant atmospheric river storm systems. And in his presentation, there's a presentation of Nashville and our flood, and he shows the structure of that atmospheric river as it builds on the Yucatan Peninsula, carries that enormous volume of water at extremely high elevations. It dropped 453 millimeters of rain in 2 days and caused major flooding. And what's happening is that thing is traveling at high elevations, and in the Nashville case, it hit a stalled cold front, and that's where it flushed. I mean, it just dropped it. And so we had upwards of as much as 20 inches of rain over certain parts of the Middle Tennessee area. Not quite that much in Nashville. And then another example of an atmospheric river were the North Louisiana floods of 2016. In the spring of 2016, there were two atmospheric rivers going on at the same time. One was pounding the upper West Coast, and the other one, similar to the Nashville flood, was being generated out of the Yucatan area, and it was dropping water like crazy over North Louisiana. That was the March of 2016 event that flooded all of Shreveport to Monroe, Louisiana. So that was Louisiana's first flood of the year. First, followed by their big flood with the southern half of the state flooded later in the year. But that's what I get from my assessment of what storms were really constituted as atmospheric rivers. But the year of 2016 was a monster year anyway, because we know starting in March, when that flooding in Louisiana occurred, just weeks later, Houston and Palestine and Brenham, Texas, all had significant major events with measures of 12 inches of rain in 24 hours, 7.5 in less than an hour in Palestine, 16 inches of rain in 24 hours in Brenham, Texas. That was the incident where the soldiers drowned in a truck. Oklahoma had big events in June. The Greenbrier Country Club, or Greenbrier Resort in White Sulphur Springs, West Virginia, 23 fatalities, 10 inches of rain, 7 of which fell in 3 hours. And this goes on all year long. In August 16th, Louisiana, 25 inches of rain in 3 days, the worst natural disaster since Hurricane Sandy. And in August, San Antonio got 9 to 11 inches of rain. And then Hurricane Matthew to kind of top off the year for them. And then we know that 2017 was the year of the enormous hurricanes, starting with Oroville Dam and all the hurricanes and Hurricane Harvey and Irma and Maria and so on. So these big events, but you've got to be prepared. You've got to constantly work on what can we do to make sure that we have an event that is not going to cause catastrophic damage for us. So in Nashville, we had a water treatment plant that we lost. This was a 90 million gallon per day water treatment plant, the Harrington plant. It produces half of the water for the city of Nashville and many of the surrounding communities. It's at the confluence of the Cumberland River and the Stones River, and it flooded. Second time, I think it flooded back in the 1970s, but it deprived us of half of the water that we normally are able to provide for the citizens of Nashville. The things that we did with that flood, and this slide shows some of the immediate repair work that went into trying to get that plant back online. But from a mitigation perspective, one of the things that helped tremendously was that we went through a controlled shutdown of that plant before the water poured into the plant. So instead of electrical systems just blowing up and exploding as water hit live systems, we shut the entire plant down, just turned it off. And so as we entered the 30 days period to reconstruct that plant, all we had to do was dry a lot of motors, and certainly there was some reconstruction of switchgear and things like that. But in the years since then, we've relocated all the emergency generators. We have expanded our generating capacity. We can run that plant at full capacity on generator power. We elevated all the electrical feeds to the plant, along with all the switchgear. We built totally new chemical feed systems, all elevated to well above levels that will ever flood again. Sealed a lot of wall penetrations. When you start flooding a plant, you start getting water running through conduit, and it'll flood more and more and more. So all of those things in combination allowed us to put that plant back online in about 30 days. And we continue to build these projects to do things that further give us assurance that we'll be damaged less in a subsequent event. This is one of our large wastewater treatment plants, totally flooded. The mitigation that's identified for that plant include the completion of construction of a flood wall around the plant, closing of a lot of storm drains. You got to know where your drainage systems run. And so that project continues to be underway. It was much longer coming back online, but we've certainly got a mitigation plan that's going to put us in much greater stead going forward. The Omohundra water treatment plant is very historic. It's probably about 150-year-old. Some of the old pumping facilities are 150 years old. This was the last vestige. This was the last 90 MGD of capacity that we had as a city. And so we had to do a good bit of sandbagging around the extremes of those pumping buildings, and we're able to save that plant, which to a great extent saved the city of Nashville. To have lost both 90 million gallon per day plants would have been absolutely catastrophic. The biosolids facility is about a $120 million biosolids facility, had 3 feet of water throughout most of it. A lot of good mitigation, still work going on in the areas of installing walls and those kinds of things. And then the typical water main replacements and drainage replacements and so on. The part of the recovery that I played a big part in was in the permitting for reconstruction. We had a lot of houses that were in floodplains. We elevated houses. The house on the left that you see here was elevated about 8 feet. Many of the houses in that neighborhood were elevated. This was a house where the lot was just cleared, and they built a new compliant structure on top of it. They loved their neighborhood, they loved their neighbors, they wanted to build a new house. This house conforms to all of our requirements, including a 4-foot freeboard. The house next door has a raised, louvered crawl space underneath. All of these houses were substantially damaged. And this house was one that was elevated without taking the brick off. Some home elevators can do it with the brick on. Some want to strip the brick off and start from scratch. But just to give you an example, as we work with homeowners, once you've declared them substantially damaged and they've got to bring that house into compliance, then you're faced with providing sufficient guidance to, meeting those freeboard requirements, the flood vent requirements, and just to show you the appreciation that we get. If I can get the audio guys to start this little audio clip.
Mr. Lindsey, this is Steve, Chadwell Drive, Madison, Tennessee. You just sent me a letter detailing why I have to raise my house and others do not. I know you're lying. I know what you did for Gibson Road with giving them a 2001 elevation certificate when you did not require them to have a new one installed. I'm going to have a copy of that. I will be taking this to the news, and I will be taking this to the Attorney General in Nashville, Tennessee, and I will be speaking to a lawyer to consider filing a grievance report against you and your division, and also seeking monetary regress. If you wish to call me, I've also spoken with, left a message with Miss Erin Williams at the mayor's office so I can inform her of the same thing. You, sir, are corrupt. You are a corrupt man, and you're not doing this equally. I will see you sooner or later in a meeting. Goodbye, sir. And
a goodbye to you too, sir. I actually have this. I saved some of these audio, these voicemail messages. It's not a big collection, but the ones that I have are great. And this is as good as any of them. It's actually saved as the youarecorrupt.wave file on my desktop. You are corrupt. The irony of this is that he had walked in my office with a 5-inch thick folder of his previous flood claims 4 times in 6 years. And he was mad because I wasn't making the owner of the rental property across the street, which may or may not have been at similar elevations. I wasn't making him elevate. And I said, well, Mr. Steve, you walked in here with your documentation. I mean, it didn't take a lot of research to establish that you were substantially damaged. And 6 months after he finished elevating his house, and he quit posting signs in the front yard about your federal government dollars at work, we made an offer to him to buy his house, and he accepted it. We're not real sure where he is right now, but he's not there anymore. We assume he's not in the floodplain anymore. But those are some, and I don't think we've gotten a thank you letter from him yet. So anyway. This was one of our favorites of all time, an advanced financial, a payday lender. This was going to be in an old Shoney's restaurant. If you're from the South, Shoney's is based in Nashville. We had an owner come in, he says, I want to remodel this old restaurant to build a payday lending office. And so we went through a laborious process to really fine-tune his damage levels. He was able to establish that he was not substantially damaged. We approved his project, and then a couple weeks later I go by and most of the old building is gone. And so I issued a stop work order, and I said, well, where's your building? You're remodeling the building. He said, well, no, we've got a plan to build a new building. And I said, well, now we're starting from scratch because you, sir, are 8 feet below the base flood elevation. And so they lawyered up, and they came in, and they made a bunch of testy comments to us. And I said, if you had told us the truth when you came in to get your permit, we wouldn't be having this discussion. I would have never issued the permit to allow you to build it. This thing is wonderfully elevated. It has long ramps. There is no drive-in window in this particular location, which they really wanted, but nonetheless, it's a good example of raising a commercial structure in a commercial zone close to a testy creek. Sources of funds, we have milked the heck out of the HMGP program. We understand that program. We're capable of putting together packages quickly. It's not uncommon to get calls at the end of the year from TEMA saying, we've got some money left over, and we're like, we'll deliver a package tomorrow morning. We're using local dollars now on a smaller scale, a Nashville scale. We got our city council to budget $5 million this year, and we're using it to pick and buy houses that otherwise wouldn't be eligible for HMGP funds or what have you. And we're just now starting a Corps of Engineers project that's been in the study phase for a while, but it's now funded, and there are 88 more houses in that project that we are targeting in one major creek basin. Some of the buyouts, these are examples of some of the places around Nashville that we bought houses. Whole streets, that light green area is now a wonderful park area, neighborhood park with walking trails. Here's another of some of the earliest of the buyouts we did. We bought 5 lots that had duplexes that flooded, it seemed, every 6 months or so. It is now a community garden, and this gives you kind of a layout of where they've put their planting beds and their composting area and things like that. Another area that's full buyout on the street, almost every house across the street has now been elevated. 1 or 2 left. I'm working with them right now, but it's an example. It was a chronic flooding neighborhood. And then again, for my good friend Mr. Steve, from his neighborhood, we had this Gibson Creek that wound its way through the neighborhood, and we've been able to pick and buy a great number of those properties. Because as you know, when you get confined areas around an urban creek like that, relatively few of those properties are owned by owners anymore. They're all rental properties. Those renters, those tenants come and go, especially after they flood. And so we're now picking, some of those lots the yellow ones I believe are vacant, and the green ones are the ones we're picking up and buying. So we're using some of that $5 million to do some of this as well. The next phase of our mitigation was that in Davidson County, this is a county of about 550 square miles, we have remapped and remodeled 450 miles of stream. Much more new LIDAR, much more effective maps. About 320 of those miles of stream was extensive new reevaluation of existing mapped streams. First time that we've remapped since the early 2000s. And then a lot of these smaller stream segments that you see on the map, the small tribs to the Cumberland River and what have you, those are newly mapped and in many cases, we've eliminated 120 miles of streams within the county that were previously unstudied A zones. We have no more unstudied A zones in the city of Nashville and Davidson County. So the new maps came out in April of 2017. There's about 150 map panels in that issuance. We've got about a dozen we're updating this year, and so we'll go into yet another little phase of public notice. And the next big thing that we did, the development of the Nashville Safe Plan. Some of you may have heard a presentation yesterday by Brantley Thames. He's with the Nashville District Corps. They're the guys that are doing all this remodeling for us. But Nashville Safe, following our flood, was the development of, the acronym SAFE stands for Situational Awareness in Flood Events. It is a flood forecasting tool. It functions with input through the whole development process and now actually through the operations process. The Corps of Engineers did all the inundation mapping for us that fed into this development of this program. USGS, we doubled the number of gauges in our county. We have 25 USGS gauging stations now. Metro gauges, those are rain gauges, about 20 of those. And then we use much better National Weather Service predictions. And then the development of action levels. This allows us, when we go into an activation of the Emergency Operations Center, to show the full layout of the county, the map. Each of these green triangles represents a gauge. They read real time, so we're able in an emergency situation to watch the progression of these different gauges. We can click on gauges. It gives us data on the stages. We can open the USGS gauge pages, the National Weather Service pages. It shows real-time inundation mapping as you tunnel down into that program. And the Nashville NERV is another component of that allows us to post public briefings to the public and those kinds of things. So there were 2 presentations. Real-time flood forecasting is something that's really in the process of being developed now with the Nashville District Corps. And the other presentation yesterday Janie Camp with Vanderbilt University, they're in the midst of finishing a study that shows us the savings that we've actually realized by having, in one case, a 4-foot freeboard, in the other case, having demolished houses after flood events, the savings that we realized by realizing that they'll never flood again. So that's another good component of things that continue on in the mitigation area. So with that, there was a lot to say. I could talk a lot longer, but I will defer to questions. Thank you.